So look at Anthony Ryder from South Lyon, Michigan, recently selected as the Lions 2020 Fan of the Year. He has a passion about sports broadcasting.
With the 112th selection in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Detroit Lions select Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver, USC. One pride, baby! Yeah! What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another Detroit Lions mock draft Monday. With less than 20 days to go until the NFL draft officially begins in Detroit, we have a ton of other prospects to still talk about and a lot of other mock draft scenarios to go over. And today, we're going to take a look at another Detroit Lions draft variation. In the past, we've talked a lot about taking defensive backs early, a lot about taking defensive players early in the draft and filling up the remainder of those defensive gaps and holes on the roster. But today we're going to take it in a little bit of a different direction. Today with the 29th overall pick, the Detroit Lions are going to start off with an offensive player as they will be addressing the offensive line early. And of course, we'll see how the rest of the draft plays out from there. With all of that being said, let's start off the 29th overall pick with the Detroit Lions selecting Jackson Powers Johnson, the center from Oregon. Now, Jackson Powers Johnson stands at 6'3", 320 pounds last season. He had an 84.5 PFF grade with 497 pass blocking snaps, allowing 0 sacks, 0 hits, and 0 quarterback hurries. In my opinion, he is the best center in this draft class, but as we've seen in the past, even the best center in the draft doesn't usually make it within the top 20 to even top 32 picks. Frank Ragnow fell to the 28th overall pick. A couple of years ago, Creed Humphrey fell to the second round despite being an all-pro caliber offensive lineman as a rookie. Last year, the best center prospect in the draft, John Michael Schmitz, fell all the way to the third round, I believe, to the New York Giants. So even though he's the best player at his position, there is a good chance that Jackson Powers Johnson not only makes it to the 29th overall pick, but if the Lions don't take him, there's a solid chance that he falls into the middle to later rounds of the second day of the draft. However, we know that Brad Holmes is not do or die by the positional value, and we know that they will potentially be looking for an interior offensive lineman this year. Graham Glasgow is 31, Kevin Zeitler is 32 and on a one-year contract, and Frank Ragnow, despite not quite being 30 yet, is potentially going to play just one more season with the Detroit Lions and potentially chase a ring. Jackson Powers Johnson gives the Detroit Lions significant depth at both the offensive guard and offensive center position this offseason, as well as being a very fluid and very seamless transition from backup center to starting center if Frank Ragnow does eventually retire after the 2024 season. Jackson Powers Johnson is a great football character guy. He's a very versatile player with the ability to play both center as well as offensive guard. His RAS score was incomplete. However, he did do some of the athletic testing where he graded as a good from the size category and great from the explosive category. He is a very good athlete. He's a very versatile football player, and I think a great character for the Detroit Lions and a player that very much fits the mantra of what the Detroit Lions love to have in Detroit. Now, moving down to the second round pick of the Detroit Lions, I did want to address defense relatively early, and there was a player that I know a lot of people really like, a player that I have been growing on over and over the past couple of weeks, and I do think the Lions will select him. But first, they will be trading down with the Arizona Cardinals, as once the 61st overall pick rolled around, the Arizona Cardinals wanted to move up. So they offer the 66th overall pick and the 104th overall pick in order to get the 61st pick as well as the 164th overall pick. So the Detroit Lions drop back 5 spots in the NFL draft, but they jump over 60 spots from 164 to 104. And with the 66th overall pick in the NFL draft, the Detroit Lions select Brandon Fisk, the 6'4", 292-pound defensive lineman from Florida State. With a 9.89 RAS score with elite explosion, speed, and agility, Braden Fisk is one of the better defensive linemen in this class and one of the most explosive athletes at the position this year. Braden Fisk last year for the Florida State Seminoles totaled 43 tackles, 9 tackles for loss, 6 sacks, 19 hurries, and played at every single defensive line position, including off-ball linebacker at some points. He did take 2 snaps as an off-ball player, which is not something you would ask him to do, but it does show he is an incredible athlete and is willing to play any position that is asked of him on the field. Now, I think Braden Fisk would be a great player for the Detroit Lions. Again, he is actually a former player of the Western Michigan Broncos, so he does have that Michigan connection a little bit, and I think he'd just be a great player for the Detroit Lions, a disruptor in the middle, a player that can create some pass rush ability, pair him next to Aleem McNeil on pass rushing downs, rotate him with DJ Reader. I think you have a really strong interior defensive line with the ability to rotate Braden Fisk pretty much anywhere on the defensive line, having the ability to stop the run, having the ability to rush the passer, and being kind of a jack of all trades defensive tackle. I think it would be a phenomenal pick at 66 for the Detroit Lions to go out and grab this star. Now, moving on to the next pick in the Detroit Lions class, the 73rd overall pick, we're sticking with the Western Michigan theme, right? Braden Fisk, a former Western Michigan Bronco, Marshawn Nealon, a current Western Michigan Bronco, the 6'3", 267-pound edge rusher from the Western Michigan Broncos, had a 9.8 RAS score, an 88 overall PFF grade with grades with great explosiveness as well as elite agility. Now, Marshawn Nealon is not a player that looks like a bendy edge rusher. He is very much not in the mold of a Micah Parsons or a Dallas Turner. He is not going to bend around the edge. He is not going to look like James Houston coming off the edge, but he is so explosive. He is so quick off the snap. His hands are lightning quick. His feet are so incredibly fast that pretty much nobody at his level of competition last year had a chance to stop Marshawn Nealon. And even though he only had 4.5 sacks a season ago and 7 tackles for loss, even though the stat sheet wasn't absolutely lit up, you watch this kid play and you see a ton of hurries, a ton of pressures, a ton of disruptiveness on the defensive line, and a player that Brad Holmes and the Detroit Lions would love to have. Now, I do think Marshawn Nealon could play a little bit on the interior as well. To me, he looks on film like an interior rusher, but for a majority of the time, actually for almost every snap he took last year, he lined up either directly across from the tackle or outside the tackle. He is a pure edge rusher in this class, and even though he doesn't have the bend, he has the quickness, he has the strength, and he has shown flashes of being a great player for the NFL team, and I do think he is a little bit of a sleeper in this class. Obviously, the production wasn't great for him last year, but the tape tells a very different story, and that story is that Marshawn Nealon is a very good football player, a very disruptive football player, and even if he's not going to get 10, 15 sacks on the edge, this is going to be a guy that offenses have to plan for, offenses have to work around, and a player that will impact the game on every rep that he gets. Now, with that being said, the Detroit Lions end up making another trade. As with the 104th overall pick, the Detroit Lions decided to trade down with Minnesota a couple of spots, picking up pick 108 as well as pick 177. And with the 108th overall pick, the Detroit Lions go back to the secondary and they address it with Kyrie Jackson, the 6'3", 194-pound defensive back with a 36.5-inch vertical jump, 32-inch arms, a 11'1" broad jump, and 4.5 speed. Kyrie Jackson is arguably one of the best cornerback prospects that nobody talks about. Despite not having elite speed, his arm length, his wingspan, and his ability to cover space is unmatched in this class. He is a very strong press man corner with long arms, an incredible vertical, a great broad jump. He's explosive, even though he's not blazing fast. 4.5 speed for a guy that's 6'3", 200 pounds is not a bad time at all. And last year with the Ducks, he totaled 34 tackles, 5 tackles for loss, 1 sack, 1 interception, 7 passes defended, while allowing a passer rating of just 41.6, while allowing just a single touchdown on the year. Now, Kyrie Jackson is one of my favorite players in this class. I do think he will be a day 2 pick. I I do think potentially even as high as a second round pick. This pick was at the very beginning of the fourth round, I believe, like the first or second pick of the third round. And or the fourth round, the third day. Kyrie Jackson to me is a underrated athlete. Obviously didn't test the best on his RAS score, but again, 4.5 speed paired with 32-inch arms, paired with a 6'3" cornerback that can jump out of the gym is not a reason for concern. So is he the fastest guy in the room? No, but he is a competitive guy. He presses really well in man. I think he could be a day one starter for the Detroit Lions, and I think putting him across from Carlton Davis would be a phenomenal move for the Detroit Lions secondary and a player that they would love to have in their cornerback room. Now moving on to pick 177, a little bit of a gap here, but the Lions are actually going to address center for the second time in this NFL draft with Bo Limmer, the center from Arkansas a season ago, a 6'5", 307-pound center. Last year, having just as an athlete, Bo Limmer is phenomenal. A 9.79 RAS score. And last year with the Hogs, he allowed just 3 sacks and 9 quarterback hurries in his first ever action at center in his career. Before that, he played primarily right guard for the Razorbacks, where again, he was really, really strong. So you might be asking, okay, well, if you draft Jackson Powers Johnson in the first round, why would you go back and you get a second center from Arkansas, a guy that allowed 3 sacks a season ago? Well, it's because it allows the Detroit Lions even more depth at the offensive line. Again, that interior is not going to stick around forever, right? Frank Ragnow may not make it through the end of next season. He may retire at the end of this upcoming season, so you need to replace that. Kevin Zeitler is, I believe, 32 and on a 1-year contract. He is likely gone after this year. Graham Glasgow's 31 and on a 3-year deal, but potentially gone after next year. So within the next 2 to 3 years, the entirety of that interior offensive line could be different. And with that being the case, I think both Jackson Powers Johnson and Bo Limmer have a bright future in the NFL. I think they could either play center or guard in the NFL. They can both play different positions. They both have versatility across the line. And I think that they would both be phenomenal depth pieces immediately, as well as potential long-term starters for the Detroit Lions a little bit down the road. Now, moving on to the pick 201, I wanted to address the edge rushing position one more time and get a player that I think is a little underrated in this class, and a player that not many people are talking about in Washington State edge rusher Brennan Jackson, standing at 6'4", 264 pounds last season, having 9 sacks and 12.5 tackles for loss for the Washington State Cougars. For Washington State, he had 26 hurries, 3 forced fumbles, 5 fumble recoveries, and 3 defensive touchdowns on the year. He is a playmaker. He is a player that I think can get after the quarterback, can stop the run really well. Is a little bit raw as a prospect, but I think can use a little bit of polishing. But if he ends up getting polished, I mean, he's a good athlete. He is 6'4". He's 264 pounds. He is a good size. He is a good strength. He looks like an NFL edge rusher, and he needs some polish for sure. He definitely needs to work on a couple of things in his game with his technique. But if he gets ironed out, if he gets polished as an edge rusher, this is a player you're talking about being a long-term starter for you. This is a player you're talking about as a bookend defensive edge rusher, a player that I think could compete for snaps on the Detroit Lions edge rush across from Aiden Hutchinson, potentially being the guy to replace Romeo Okwara. Now, 4 picks later at pick 205, the Detroit Lions select Al Walcott, the safety from Arkansas. 6'2", 211 pounds, 7 career interceptions, 11 career passes defended, 11.5 career tackles for loss, 2 sacks, 3 forced fumbles, and 2 defensive touchdowns in his career. I don't think Al Walcott is going to be a starter for the Detroit Lions in the secondary. I don't think he's necessarily going to take snaps away from Kirby or Ifiatu, but I do think he will be a really good core special teams player, a player potentially to replace, Chase Lucas that the Lions lost this offseason, or a potential of another special teams core member. I think this is a special teams pick. This is a guy that will run, will hit, will force some fumbles, will lay the wood, but probably will never be the biggest or fastest player in the secondary. I think you could rely on him in a game or two in a pinch, but you're probably not going to have him being a full-time starter anytime in the league. This is pretty purely in the 7th round, a a special teams ace, right? A special teams player that you expect to be around for 4 to 5 years, and a player that, will be cheap, will be effective, and will do his job to the best of his ability. And then with pick 249, a player that I really like in this NFL draft and a player the Lions have already had a top 30 visit with is Anthony Gold, the 5'8", 172-pound wide receiver from Oregon State. Yes, you heard me correctly. Despite Brad Holmes having a thing for big body X wide receivers, Anthony Gold seems to be on the radar, who had 44 receptions last year with Oregon State, 711 yards, 2 touchdowns, averaging 16.2 yards per reception with an 8.86 RAS score. Now, Anthony Gold is a player that, to me, is a little bit of an Amon-Ra St. Brown type. He reminds me a lot of Amon-Ra St. Brown in the way that he plays the game. He runs his routes really well. He is very aggressive after the catch. He is not afraid of contact. He is just a really kind of an undersized wide receiver. I don't think he blows you away anything athletically on the film, but to me, he does have that Lion-esque, I guess, aura around him, if that makes sense. He is a player that runs routes the right way, that creates separation, who has strong hands, who fights through contact, who's not afraid to, get hit, and he's not afraid to hit back and dish out a little bit of punishment. Not to mention, he actually runs in the 4.3. He's running a 4.39 at the combine and has, again, a really, really strong RAS score. The Lions have already interviewed him both at the combine and for a top 30 visit. And I do think if he's available in the later 7th round, I think this is a guy the Lions not only have their eye on, but potentially could be really excited to implement into their offense. He's a little bit small. He's a little bit undersized, but he tracks the ball really well down the field. He's a great deep threat. He's a really solid route runner, great after the catch, strong hands. If he was a little bit bigger, if he stood at, 5'11", even 6 foot, and was a few pounds heavier, I think this is a day 2 guy just based on the tape, and a guy that is going very heavily underrated because it's hard to succeed in the NFL at 5'8". But with all of that being said, that is my Detroit Lions mock draft. Going over it one more time really quickly. Jackson Powers-Johnson at 29, Braden Fisk at 66, Marshawn Nealon at 73, Kyrie Jackson at 108, Bo Limmer at 177, Brendan Jackson at 201, Al Walcott at 205, and Anthony Gold at 249. I think it secures a lot of future success for the Lions offensive line, gives you a rotational pass rusher, or a couple of rotational pass rushers at 66, 73, and 201, gives you a potential starting boundary cornerback. And even though this is a class that you might not see a lot of results from in year 1, year 2 comes around and Jackson Powers-Johnson's a starter, Bo Limmer's a potential role player, you have Braden Fisk, who's a potential guy that's starting, Marshawn Nealon could develop into a starter, Kyrie Jackson could develop into a starter. If you develop Brendan Jackson, he's a starter, right? So year 1, you might not see a whole lot of success, but come year 2, you're taking a look at 3, 4, maybe even 5 starters on the opposite side of the ball, and you're taking a look at some really good talent, and I trust our coaching staff to develop the talent around them. So with all of that being said, that is my mock draft for the Detroit Lions, a 3.0 mock draft addressing offensive center first. Let me know down in the comments below what kind of mock draft you want to see for next Monday, whether it be a trade-up scenario, a wide receiver scenario, or any other scenario you want to see play out for the Lions this offseason. I'd be happy to do so. With all of that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, and as always, go Lions.